My name is Margaret, and the day my son told me to leave my own home was the day I realized how little I'd been seen. I was 68 years old, standing in the kitchen where I'd baked his birthday cakes, mended his torn jeans, and wiped away his tears when he looked at me with eyes so cold they didn't belong to the boy I'd raised. "Mom," he said, his voice sharp like a blade slicing through years of love. "This house isn't yours anymore. You're lucky we let you stay here." His wife, Karen, stood behind him, arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line that screamed agreement. I felt my hands tremble, not from age, but from the weight of their words. The house wasn't mine. The house where I'd carried my husband Tom over the threshold when we were young and foolish, where we'd scraped together every penny to pay the mortgage, where we'd laughed and cried and built a life I wanted to scream to shake them until they remembered who I was. But I didn't. I stood there silent, my heart splintering like old wood. I'd been a widow for 6 years by then. Tom's heart gave out one spring morning right there in the garden he loved, among the roses we'd planted together. I still see him sometimes, in the way the light hits the petals or the creak of the porch swing he built. After he was gone, I poured myself into the family, my son Michael, his wife Karen, their 2 teenage kids, even my sister-in-law Ruth, who'd always had a knack for pointing out my flaws. I cooked dinners, babysat, mended clothes, and listened to their troubles, all while carrying the ache of Tom's absence like a stone in my chest. I thought that's what mothers did. I thought love was enough to keep a family whole. But love, I learned, can be a one-way street, and I'd been walking it alone for longer than I cared to admit. That night, after Michael's words cut me open, I sat in my bedroom, the same room where Tom and I had whispered dreams to each other, where we'd planned for a future that was now just a memory. The walls were lined with photos, Michael as a baby, his graduation, our family at the lake. Each one felt like a lie. I stared at the mirror, at the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, and wondered when I'd become invisible. Was it when Tom died? When I stopped being the one who fixed everything? Or had I always been fading, and I was just too busy loving them to notice I didn't cry, though I wanted to? Instead, I felt something else. A flicker of anger, small but alive like a match struck in the dark. I didn't know what it meant yet, but it was there, warming the edges of my grief. The next morning, I woke to the sound of Karen's voice downstairs, sharp and impatient, telling the kids to hurry up for school. I stayed in my room longer than usual, avoiding the kitchen where I'd once been the heart of the house. When I finally went down, the table was a mess of cereal bowls and spilled coffee. Karen didn't look up from her phone. "Margaret," she said, not even using Mom anymore, "can you clean this up? I've got a meeting." "No, please, no thank you, just an order," as if I were a maid in my own home. I nodded because that's what I'd always done, but as I scrubbed the sticky table, that flicker of anger grew. I thought of Tom, how he'd always said I was the strongest person he knew. "Maggie," he'd whisper, "you're the glue that holds us all together." Where was that woman now, buried under years of giving, of swallowing my own needs to make room for theirs? Days turned into weeks, and the house became a battlefield of small slights. Michael barely spoke to me, his eyes always on his phone or his work. Karen treated me like an inconvenience, rolling her eyes when I offered to cook or snapping when I left a cup in the sink. The kids, once my little shadows, now barely acknowledged me, their earbuds a wall between us. Ruth, who'd moved in after her own husband passed, was the worst. She'd sit at the dining table sipping her tea and say things like, "Margaret, you're so lucky to have Michael and Karen." Most kids wouldn't let their mother stay rent-free. Rent-free, I wanted to laugh to tell her this house was mine, paid for with Tom's sweat and my sacrifices. But I didn't. I'd learned to keep quiet, to let their words slide over me like rain. But rain, I was starting to realize, could erode even the strongest stone. One afternoon, I found myself in the attic looking for an old quilt Tom's mother had made. The air was thick with dust, and the light from a single bulb cast shadows across boxes of our life Christmas decorations, Michael's old toys, Tom's fishing gear. I sat on the floor, the quilt in my lap, and let the memories wash over me. I remembered the day we signed the papers for this house, how Tom had spun me around in the empty living room, promising we'd fill it with love. I remembered the nights I stayed up balancing the checkbook to make sure we could keep it. And I remembered the day Michael was born right here in this house, because we couldn't afford a hospital. This house wasn't just walls and wood, it was my heart, my history, my proof that I'd built something lasting. And they thought they could take it from me. I don't know how long I sat there, but when I stood, I felt different. Not stronger, not yet, but awake. I folded the quilt and carried it downstairs, placing it on my bed, like a reminder of who I'd been. That night, I heard Michael and Karen arguing in the living room. She's not contributing anything. Karen said, her voice low but clear, "We can't keep carrying her." Carrying me, I wanted to storm in to tell them I'd carried them all through Michael's college loans, Karen's business startup, even Ruth's medical bills. But I didn't. Instead, I opened my nightstand drawer and pulled out the deed to the house the one Tom and I had signed all those years ago. My name was still there in black ink next to his. I traced the letters, and that flicker of anger became a flame. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in years. I put on my favorite dress, the blue one Tom always said made my eyes shine, and I walked to the library. It was a mile away and my knees ached, but I needed to be somewhere that wasn't theirs. The library was quiet, filled with the soft rustle of pages and the scent of old books. I sat at a computer, my hands unsteady on the keys, and started searching. I didn't know what I was looking for at first, maybe a lawyer, maybe a way to understand my rights. But as I scrolled, I found stories of other women like me who'd been pushed aside by their families only to find their way back to themselves. Their words were like a lifeline, pulling me out of the fog I'd been living in. That's when I met Clara. She was sitting at the next computer, her silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She must have seen something in my face because she leaned over and said, "Honey, you look like you're carrying the world. Want to tell me about it?" I don't know why I trusted her, but I did. Over coffee at the library cafe, I poured out my story. Michael's words, Karen's coldness, Ruth's barbs, the house that was mine but felt like a prison. Clara listened, her eyes kind but fierce, and when I finished, she took my hand. "Margaret," she said, "you're not invisible. You're a force. And it's time you reminded them of that." Clara was 72, a retired school teacher who'd faced her own betrayals, a daughter who'd cut her off a brother who'd cheated her out of an inheritance. She'd rebuilt her life piece by piece, and now she volunteered at the library, helping women like me find their footing. She didn't push, didn't preach, but she gave me a gift, the idea that I could choose myself, even now, even after everything. We started meeting every week, and those hours with Clara became my sanctuary. She showed me how to look up property laws, how to check my finances, how to protect what was mine. But more than that, she reminded me of the woman I'd been, the one who'd balanced a family on her shoulders, who'd laughed with Tom in the moonlight, who'd never backed down from a fight. I started small. I stopped cleaning up after Karen's messes. I stopped cooking dinners they didn't thank me for. I started saying no when Ruth asked me to run her errands. They noticed, of course. Karen's sighs grew louder. Michael's jaw tightened, and Ruth muttered about my attitude. But I didn't care. I was done shrinking to fit their idea of me. And in the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, I started to plan. I didn't know what yet, but I knew I wasn't leaving my home. Not because they told me to, not because they thought I was nothing. This was my house, my life, and I was going to fight for it. Those first steps toward reclaiming myself felt like learning to walk again after a long illness. Each small act of defiance, leaving Karen's dishes in the sink, saying no to Ruth's endless demands, locking my bedroom door at night, built a fragile scaffolding around my heart. But fragility, I was learning, could still hold weight. Clara's words echoed in my mind. "You're a force, Margaret." I didn't feel like one, not yet, but I clung to the idea like a lifeline, letting it pull me through the days when the house felt more like a cage than a home. I was still here, still breathing, still Margaret, and that had to mean something. The weeks that followed Michael's ultimatum were a strange dance of silence and tension. I moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding the spaces where I'd once been the center. The kitchen where I'd spent decades stirring soups and kneading dough now felt like Karen's domain. She'd rearranged the cabinets, tossing out my old recipe cards without a word. The living room where Tom and I had danced to scratchy records was now a shrine to Michael's work, his laptop always open, papers strewn across the coffee table. Even the garden, my sanctuary, bore Karen's touch. She'd planted garish marigolds where Tom's roses once thrived. I let them think they'd claimed it all. I let them believe I was fading. But in my heart, I was counting every slight, every dismissal, storing them like kindling for a fire I wasn't ready to light. Clara became my anchor. Our weekly meetings at the library grew into something sacred, a space where I could be Margaret, not just mom or grandma or the burden they'd made me out to be. She'd sit across from me, her eyes bright with a mischief that belied her age, and share stories of her own battles. When my daughter told me I was too old to matter, she said once stirring her coffee, I sold the family cabin she loved and donated the money to a women's shelter. Her face when she found out worth every penny. I laughed, but the idea stuck. What did I have that they didn't expect? What could I do that would make them see me? One rainy afternoon, Clara handed me a flyer for a local women's group that met at the community center. "It's not therapy," she said, catching my hesitation. "It's just women like us talking, learning, rebuilding. You don't have to say a word if you don't want to." I tucked the flyer into my purse, unsure. The idea of sitting in a circle of strangers, spilling my pain, felt like peeling off my skin in public. But the next evening, when I heard Karen snap at Michael about dealing with your mother, I pulled out the flyer and made up my mind. I wasn't going to let their words define me anymore. The women's group was held in a small room with mismatched chairs and a coffee pot that never stopped brewing. The women were a mix, some my age, some younger, some older, their faces etched with stories they didn't need to tell. The facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Joan, welcomed me with a smile and no pressure to speak. I sat quietly that first night listening as others shared their losses, a daughter who'd stopped calling a husband, who'd left after 30 years a job that had discarded them for someone younger. Their voices wove a tapestry of grief and resilience, and though I didn't speak, I felt less alone. I went back the next week and the week after that, each meeting chipping away at the weight I'd carried. At home, the slights continued. Ruth took to leaving Post-it notes on the fridge listing chores she thought I should do to earn my keep. Michael stopped asking how I was. His conversations with me reduced to grunts or instructions. "Mom, don't touch the thermostat." Karen's disdain was bolder now. She'd talk over me at dinner as if my voice were just background noise. The kids caught in their teenage world didn't notice the shift, but their indifference stung just as much. I'd spent years tying their shoes, reading them stories, baking cookies for their school events, and now I was just the old woman in the upstairs room. But I wasn't invisible, not anymore. Clara and the women's group were teaching me that. One evening, after a particularly cutting remark from Ruth about my laziness, I went to the attic again. I wasn't looking for anything specific this time, just a place to breathe, to remember. I found a box of Tom's old things tucked behind a broken lamp. Inside were his watch, the one he'd worn every day, its face scratched but still ticking, a stack of letters we'd written during our courtship, and a small notebook where he'd jotted down plans for the house. I opened the notebook, and there in his familiar scrawl was a list: pay off mortgage ad, porch swing, build Ellie's garden shed. Ellie. He'd always called me that when we were young, when the world felt full of possibility. I slipped the watch onto my wrist, its weight grounding me, and took the notebook to my room. That night I started writing. Not a diary, not exactly, but a record of my life. every sacrifice, every joy, every moment I'd given to this family. I wrote about the years Tom and I went without vacations to save for the house, the nights I worked late to cover Michael's tuition the way I'd held Karen's hand when her business nearly failed. I wrote about the pain of their rejection, the way their words had carved holes in me. But I also wrote about Clara, about the women's group, about the spark that was growing inside me. Writing became my rebellion, a way to claim my story when they tried to erase it. I began to notice things I'd ignored before. The house, my house, was still in my name, but Michael and Karen acted as if it were theirs. They'd made changes without asking, repainting the dining room, replacing my curtains with ones Karen picked. They'd even started talking about when we sell this place as if I had no say. I remembered Clara's advice. Check your assets, Margaret. You'd be surprised what you still control. So I did. I went back to the library, this time alone, and pulled up the county records. The deed was clear, Margaret Elizabeth Thompson, sole owner after Tom's death. I printed the page, folded it carefully, and hid it in the notebook with Tom's watch. I also checked my bank accounts, the ones I'd let sit since Tom passed. There was more than I'd expected, not a fortune, but enough to give me options. Tom and I had been frugal, saving for a retirement we never got to share. I'd used some to help Michael and Karen over the years, but I'd never told them how much was left. They assumed I was dependent on them, that I had nothing. Let them think that I decided. Let them underestimate me. I wasn't ready to act, not yet, but I was preparing, gathering strength like a storm building on the horizon. At the women's group, I finally spoke. It was a quiet night, the rain tapping against the windows, and Joan asked if anyone wanted to share. My voice shook at first, but I told them about Michael's words, about Karen's coldness, about the house that was mine, but felt stolen. The women listened, their eyes soft with understanding, and when I finished, Joan reached for my hand. "You're not just fighting for a house, Margaret," she said. "You're fighting for yourself." I nodded, tears burning my eyes, and for the first time, I believed her. Back home, I started to carry myself differently. I wore Tom's watch every day, its ticking a reminder of the life we'd built. I stopped apologizing for existing in my own space. When Karen left dishes piled in the sink, I let them sit until she dealt with them. When Ruth left another note, I tore it up and threw it away. Michael noticed the change, his brow furrowing when I met his eyes without flinching. "What's gotten into you, Mom?" he asked. Once his tone more annoyed than curious. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I was done explaining myself to people who didn't see me. Clara, sensing my shift, pushed me further. "What do you want, Margaret?" she asked one afternoon, her eyes locking onto mine. "Not what they want. Not what Tom would have wanted. What do you want?" The question stopped me cold. For so long, my wants had been buried under everyone else's needs. I thought of the house of Tom's roses, of the life I'd poured into this family. I thought of the women's group, of the stories that had given me strength. And I thought of myself, the Margaret, who'd once dreamed of painting, of traveling, of being more than a mother and wife. "I want to be seen," I said finally. "I want to be enough." Clara smiled, fierce and proud. "Then show them," she said. "Show them who you are." I didn't know how yet, but I knew she was right. The house was mine, the life was mine, and I was going to claim them both. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with the quiet strength that I was beginning to remember. The storm was coming, and I was ready to let it break. Clara's challenge to show them who I was became a quiet drumbeat in my chest, steady and unrelenting. It wasn't about shouting or storming through the house with demands. It was about rebuilding the woman I'd let slip away piece by careful piece. I'd spent so long bending to fit their expectations, shrinking to avoid their irritation, that I'd forgotten how it felt to stand tall. But now, with Tom's watch ticking on my wrist and the deed to my house hidden in my nightstand, I was starting to remember. I was Margaret, not just their mother, their grandmother, their burden. And I was done letting them define me. The women's group became my lifeline, a place where I could breathe without the weight of Karen's sighs or Ruth's barbs. Each week I shared a little more, my voice growing steadier as I spoke of the pain, the betrayal, the flicker of hope I was nurturing. The other women nodded their eyes, reflecting my own struggles, and their stories wove strength into me. One woman, Grace, told of how she'd left her ungrateful son's home and started a small bakery, proving to herself she was more than a forgotten mother. Another, Linda, spoke of rewriting her will to leave her estate to a charity rather than her dismissive daughters. Their courage was contagious, and I carried it home with me, letting it settle into my bones. At the house, the tension was palpable. My small rebellions, ignoring Karen's messes, refusing Ruth's chores, holding Michael's gaze without apology, had shifted the air. Karen's impatience flared into outright hostility. One morning, as I poured my coffee, she slammed a cupboard shut and said, "If you're not going to help around here, Margaret, maybe you should find somewhere else to go." Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. I looked at her, my cup steady in my hands, and said, "This is my home, Karen. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes widened, then narrowed, but she didn't respond. For the first time, I saw a crack in her certainty, and it fueled me. Michael was harder to read. He'd always been my soft-spoken boy, the one who'd clung to me during thunderstorms, who'd promised to take care of me when Tom was gone. But that boy was buried under years of stress work and Karen's influence. Now he avoided me, his silence louder than any argument. I missed him, ached for the son who'd once looked at me like I was his world. But I couldn't keep chasing him, begging for scraps of affection. I had to let him go, at least for now, and focus on saving myself. Ruth, though, was relentless. Her comments grew sharper, laced with a cruelty I hadn't seen in her before. "You're living off Michael's generosity," she said one evening, her voice dripping with disdain as we sat at the dinner table. The kids were upstairs. Karen was at a meeting, and Michael was engrossed in his phone. I set my fork down, my pulse quickening. "Ruth," I said, my voice calm but firm, "this house is paid for, by me and Tom. If anyone's living off generosity, it's you." Michael's head snapped up, his eyes flicking between us. Ruth's face reddened, but before she could retort, I stood and left the room. My hands shook as I climbed the stairs, but I felt alive, electric. I'd spoken my truth, and it hadn't broken me. That night, I pulled out my notebook and wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about Ruth's words, Michael's silence, Karen's demands. But I also wrote about the women's group, about Clara's fierce belief in me, about the deed that proved this house was mine. Writing was my way of holding myself together, of reminding myself that I wasn't the nothing they saw. And as I wrote, an idea began to form, hazy but persistent. The house was mine, but it was more than walls and memories. It was power leverage, a way to show them who I was. I wasn't ready to act on it yet, but the seed was planted, and I could feel it taking root. The next week I did something bold, at least bold for me. I called a lawyer. Clara had given me the name of a woman she trusted, someone who specialized in property and estate issues. I met her in a small office downtown, my heart pounding as I explained my situation, the house in my name, my son's assumption that it was his, the way I'd been treated like a tenant. The lawyer, Ms. Delgado, listened with a calm that put me at ease. "Margaret," she said, her voice steady, "you have more control than you realize. The deed is clear, and you've been the one paying the property taxes, correct?" I nodded, surprised. I hadn't thought of that. "Then let's make a plan," she said. "Not to fight, but to protect what's yours." We spent an hour discussing options, updating my will, setting up a trust, ensuring the house couldn't be contested. She suggested I get an appraisal just to know the property's current value. "Knowledge is power," she said, and I believed her. I left her office with a folder of papers and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I didn't tell anyone, not even Clara. This was mine, my quiet rebellion, and I wanted to hold it close until I was ready. Back at the house, I started to reclaim small pieces of my space. I dug up Karen's marigolds and replanted Tom's roses, their roots still strong beneath the soil. I hung my old curtains in my bedroom, the ones with the soft blue flowers Tom had loved. I even started painting again, something I hadn't done since Michael was a boy. I set up an easel in the attic, using old supplies I'd found in a box. My hands were unsteady at first, but as I brushed color onto the canvas, deep blues, warm golds, the red of Tom's roses, I felt like myself again. The paintings weren't masterpieces, but they were mine-proof that I could still create, still feel, still matter. Clara noticed the change in me. "You're glowing, Margaret," she said one afternoon at the library, her eyes twinkling. "What's got you so alive?" I told her about the lawyer, the roses, the painting, and she clapped her hands like a child. "That's my girl," she said. "You're not just taking back your house, you're taking back your life." I smiled, but inside I knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. The house was mine, but they still treated it like theirs. They still saw me as a burden, a relic to be tolerated. I needed to do more to make them see me not out of anger, but out of truth. At the women's group, I shared my plan to meet with the lawyer again to finalize my decisions about the house. The women cheered me on their voices, a chorus of strength. Joan, the facilitator, suggested I write a letter not to send, but to clarify my own heart. Sometimes, she said, putting it on paper helps you see what you really want. So I did. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I wrote a letter to Michael, Karen, and Ruth. I poured out everything, the love I'd given, the pain they'd caused, the truth about the house. I wrote about Tom, about the life we'd built, about the woman I was becoming again. I didn't know if I'd ever show it to them, but writing it felt like shedding a skin I'd outgrown. The appraisal came back, and the number shocked me. The house, our modest home, was worth far more than I'd imagined, thanks to the rising market and the land it sat on. I tucked the report away with the deed, my heart racing. This wasn't just a house, it was a legacy, a power I hadn't fully understood. I started to think about what I could do with it, not just for me, but for others. The women's group had given me so much. What if I could give back? What if I could help women like Grace, like Linda, like me, who'd been discarded but were still fighting? The idea felt too big, too bold, but it wouldn't let me go. One evening, as I sat in the garden watching the roses catch the last light, Michael came outside. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped. "Mom," he said, his voice softer than it had been in months, "can we talk?" My heart leapt, hoping for a moment of the boy I'd raised. But then he said, "Karen and I are thinking of selling the house. We need the money for the kids' college. You'd be okay, right? We'd find you a place." My stomach twisted, but I kept my face calm. "This is my home, Michael," I said, my voice steady. "It's not for sale." He blinked, confused, then walked away, muttering something about talking later. But I knew there'd be no later, not until I was ready. I went inside, pulled out my notebook, and wrote one word: enough. I was done waiting, done hoping they'd see me on their own. The storm I'd been building was ready to break, and when it did, they'd know exactly who Margaret Elizabeth Thompson was. Michael's words about selling the house lit a fire in me that burned hotter than I expected. It wasn't just the audacity of assuming he could decide my future. It was the erasure of everything Tom and I had built, the casual dismissal of my life's work. I sat in my room that night, Tom's watch heavy on my wrist, and stared at the deed, the appraisal, the notebook filled with my truth. I'd been patient, quiet, gathering my strength like a river carving stone. But now I felt the current quickening. I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting for myself, for the Margaret who'd been buried under years of sacrifice. And I was ready to rise. The next morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I put on my blue dress, the one Tom loved, and walked to the garden. The roses were blooming their petals, defiant against the autumn chill. I knelt in the dirt, my hands tracing the roots I'd replanted, and made a promise to myself I would honor the life I'd built, not just for Tom, not just for Michael, but for me. I brushed the soil from my knees, and went inside to make a plan. No more waiting for them to see me. I would show them in my own way on my own terms. I started with the lawyer, Ms. Delgado. We met again in her office, the folder of papers I'd brought now thicker with my research and notes. I told her about Michael's plan to sell the house, about the appraisal, about my desire to protect what was mine. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes sharp with understanding. "Margaret," she said, "you're in a strong position. The house is yours, and they have no legal claim. But you need to decide what you want long term. Do you want to stay to fight for it, or do you want something else?" Her question echoed. Clara's, "What do you want?" I took a deep breath and said, "I want to stay. But I also want to make sure they can't take it from me or from anyone else I choose to share it with." Ms. Delgado nodded and outlined a plan. We'd update my will to reflect my wishes, create a trust to protect the house, and draft a letter to Michael and Karen, formally asserting my ownership. "This isn't about confrontation," she said. "It's about clarity. They need to know where you stand. I like that clarity, not anger. I wasn't looking to hurt them, but I was done letting them hurt me." She also suggested I meet with a financial advisor to review my savings and explore options for the future. "You have more resources than you think," she said, and I believed her. For the first time, I saw my money not as a safety net for them, but as a tool for me. Back at the women's group, I shared my progress. The room buzzed with encouragement as I told them about the lawyer, the trust, the roses I'd replanted. Joan, the facilitator, smiled and said, "Margaret, you're not just reclaiming your house, you're reclaiming your power." The word power struck me. I'd never thought of myself as powerful, not when I was balancing budgets or soothing Michael's fears or holding Tom's hand in the hospital. But now I felt it, a quiet, steady force, like the roots of those roses holding firm beneath the surface. At home, I moved with purpose. I stopped tiptoeing around Karen's moods or Ruth's demands. I cooked meals for myself, setting a single plate at the table, and ate in the garden, the roses my only company. I hung my paintings in my bedroom, their colors a rebellion against the beige walls Karen favored. I even started humming again old songs Tom and I loved, letting my voice fill the silence. They noticed, of course. Karen's glares grew sharper, Ruth's muttering louder, but I didn't care. I was done shrinking. One afternoon, I found an old photo album in the attic, one I hadn't seen in years. It was filled with pictures of Tom and me in our early days dancing at a friend's wedding, laughing on a picnic painting, the house when we first moved in. I sat on the floor, tears blurring the pages, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude, of remembrance. I'd been so much more than a mother, a wife, a widow. I'd been a dreamer, a fighter, a woman who'd built a life from love and grit. I took the album to my room and placed it on my nightstand, a reminder of who I was. That evening, I did something symbolic, something just for me. I took one of Tom's old shirts from the attic, a soft flannel he'd worn in the garden, and cut it into strips. I wove the strips into a small braid, tying it with a ribbon from my wedding bouquet, and hung it on my bedroom door. It was a quiet act, but it felt like a declaration. This is my space, my history, my heart. When Karen saw it, she frowned but said nothing. Ruth predictably scoffed. "What's that supposed to be, Margaret?" "Some kind of art project," I smiled and said, "It's a reminder." She didn't ask what I meant, and I didn't explain. Clara pushed me to think bigger. "You're doing great, Margaret," she said over coffee at the library. "But what's next? You've got the house, the money, the strength. What do you want to do with it?" I thought of the women's group, of Grace's bakery, of Linda's charity. I thought of the house so full of memories, but also so full of potential. I want to help women like us. I said the words surprising me as they left my mouth. Women who've been forgotten, who need a place to start over. Clara's eyes lit up. "Now you're talking," she said. "Your house could be a sanctuary, a place for second chances." The idea took hold, growing roots as deep as the roses. I started researching with Clara's help, looking into nonprofit organizations' grants, zoning laws. I didn't tell the family not yet. They didn't need to know. But I met with Ms. Delgado again this time to discuss turning the house into a trust for a women's shelter or a community space. It's ambitious, she said, but doable. You'd need to plan carefully, but it could be your legacy. Legacy. The word felt heavy, but right. Tom and I had built this house for love. Maybe it could hold love for others, too. At the women's group, I shared my dream. The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Grace offered to help with fundraising. Linda knew someone who'd done something similar, and Joan promised to connect me with local organizations. Their support felt like wings lifting me higher than I'd thought possible. I went home that night and painted a bold canvas of reds and golds, a woman rising from shadows. It was me or who I was becoming. But the house was still a battlefield. Michael brought up selling again, this time at dinner with Karen and Ruth present. "Mom," he said, his tone patronizing, "we found a great assisted living place for you. It's affordable and you'd be comfortable. We need to move forward with the sale." Karen nodded. Ruth smirked, and I felt the air tighten. I set my glass down, my heart steady. "Michael," I said, "this house is in my name. I'm not selling, and I'm not leaving." The table went silent. Karen's fork froze mid-air. Ruth's mouth opened, and Michael stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice sharp. I didn't answer. I stood, cleared my plate, and walked away, leaving them to their shock. That night I wrote in my notebook, "They think they know me, but they don't. They think they control this house, but they're wrong. I'm not just staying. I'm building something new." I closed the notebook and looked at the braid on my door, the album on my nightstand, the painting on my easel. I was Margaret, and I was enough. The trust was in motion, the lawyer was drafting papers, and the women's group was behind me. I didn't know how Michael and Karen would react when the truth came out, but I was ready. Not for revenge, but for justice, the quiet, dignified kind that comes from standing in your truth. The next morning, I went to the garden and planted a new rose bush, one I'd bought with my own money. Its buds were small, but they held promise. I patted the soil, my hands steady, and whispered, "This is for me." The house loomed behind me, its windows catching the dawn. It was mine, not just in name, but in spirit. And soon it would be more a home for others, a testament to what women like me could do when we refused to be forgotten. The rose bush I planted became my touchstone, a quiet symbol of the life I was rebuilding. Each morning I'd check its buds, their slow unfurling a mirror to my own unfolding. I was no longer just surviving in my house. I was claiming it not with loud declarations, but with deliberate, steady choices. The trust papers were being drafted, my savings were being reorganized, and my vision for the house, a sanctuary for women like me, was taking shape. But the weight of Michael's assumptions, Karen's hostility, and Ruth's disdain still pressed against me. I was ready to stand my ground, but I knew the hardest part was coming, showing them the truth without losing myself to anger. At the women's group, my dream of turning the house into a sanctuary sparked a fire. The women didn't just support me, they joined me. Grace offered to teach baking classes for future residents. Linda connected me with a grant writer, and Joan introduced me to a local nonprofit that helped women start over. Their belief in me was a balm soothing the wounds Michael and Karen's words had left. One night, as we sat in our circle, Joan handed me a small hand-stitched notebook. "For your plans," she said, her eyes warm, "you're writing a new chapter. Margaret, not just for you, but for all of us." I held the notebook, its soft cover grounding me, and felt a surge of purpose. This wasn't just about my house anymore. It was about every woman who'd been told she was too old, too weak, too invisible. Clara, ever my fiercest ally, pushed me to think practically. "You've got the heart, Margaret," she said over coffee, her voice sharp with excitement, "but you need a timeline. When do you tell them? How do you make this real?" I'd been wrestling with those questions myself. The lawyer had finalized the trust, naming the house as a future community space for women in need. My will was updated, leaving my savings to the non-profit with a small portion for Michael's children, but only when they were older. I'd even met with the financial advisor who helped me set up a modest fund to cover initial costs. Everything was in place, but telling Michael and Karen felt like stepping into a storm I couldn't predict. "I'll know when the moment comes," I told Clara, my voice steadier than I felt. She raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Just don't wait too long," she said. "You're not hiding anymore." She was right. I'd spent years hiding my pain, my strength, my dreams. Now I was ready to step into the light, but I wanted to do it my way with dignity, not drama. At home, the tension was a living thing, coiling tighter with each passing day. Karen had stopped speaking to me altogether, her silence a weapon sharper than her words. Ruth's comments grew bolder, each one a jab meant to wound. "You're acting like you own the place, Margaret," she said one morning, her teacup clinking against its saucer. I looked at her, my heart calm, and said I do. She laughed, thinking I was joking, but Michael, who was grabbing his keys nearby, froze. His eyes met mine, searching, but I didn't look away. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in his gaze, and it gave me strength. I started making changes to the house, small but deliberate. I moved my paintings from my bedroom to the hallway, their vibrant colors, a quiet rebellion against Karen's sterile decor. I replaced the dining room curtains with ones I'd sewn myself using fabric from Tom's old shirts. I even cleared out a corner of the attic, setting up a desk where I could work on my plans for the sanctuary. Each act was a stitch in the fabric of my new life, a way to say, "This is mine, and I'm here." One afternoon, I found a letter in the mailbox addressed to me in an unfamiliar hand. It was from the non-profit Joan had connected me with, inviting me to a meeting to discuss my vision. They were interested not just in the house, but in me, my story, my strength. I read the letter in the garden, the roses swaying in the breeze, and felt tears prick my eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of possibility. I tucked the letter into my notebook, the one Joan had given me, and started sketching ideas: a communal kitchen, a library, a garden where women could heal. The house was already a home. Now it could be a haven. But the family's assumptions kept crashing against my resolve. One evening, as I sat in the living room sketching, Karen stormed in her face, tight with anger. "Margaret," she said, her voice cutting, "we're having a realtor come tomorrow. You need to pack up some of your things to make the house look presentable." My pencil stopped. I looked up, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "There's no need for a realtor, Karen," I said. "This house isn't for sale." She laughed, sharp and dismissive. "You don't get to decide that. Michael and I have already talked about it." I set my notebook down, stood and faced her. "You're wrong," I said. "This house is in my name. I decide." Her mouth opened, then closed, her eyes flashing with disbelief. She turned and left, but I knew this wasn't over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my attic desk, the nonprofit's letter open beside me, and wrote in my notebook, not to Michael or Karen, but to myself. I wrote about the girl I'd been full of dreams, and the woman I'd become scarred, but strong. I wrote about Tom, whose love had anchored me, and the women's group, whose courage had lifted me. And I wrote about the sanctuary, a place where no woman would feel discarded. As dawn broke, I closed the notebook and felt a quiet certainty. The time was coming, and I was ready. The next morning, I called Ms. Delgado and asked her to prepare the letter asserting my ownership. "I want it formal," I said, "but I want to deliver it myself." She agreed, promising to have it ready by the end of the week. I also met with the nonprofit, a small team of women who listened to my vision with respect and enthusiasm. They offered to help with permits, funding, even staffing. "You're not alone in this, Margaret," their director set her hand on mine. I left the meeting feeling lighter, as if the house was already transforming its walls, expanding to hold new stories. At the women's group, I shared the nonprofit support, and the room erupted in cheers. Grace hugged me. Linda promised to help with outreach, and Joan handed me a small rose-shaped pendant. "For your courage," she said. I wore it around my neck, its weight a reminder of the roots I was planting. Clara, when I told her, grinned like a cat. "You're not just showing them Margaret," she said. "You're building a legacy." I smiled, but inside I knew the hardest part was still ahead, facing Michael, Karen, and Ruth with the truth. Back home, I kept my routine painting, gardening, planning, but I felt the storm gathering. Michael was quieter now, his glances longer, as if he sensed something shifting. Karen's anger simmered, her movements sharp and restless. Ruth, oblivious, kept up her barbs, but they bounced off me now. I was no longer the Margaret who flinched. I was the Margaret who'd replanted roses, who'd woven Tom's shirt into a braid, who'd turned a house into a dream. One evening, as I watered the roses, Michael joined me in the garden. His face was drawn, his voice hesitant. "Mom," he said, "Karen's serious about the realtor. I know you love this house, but we need the money. You understand, right?" I set the watering can down, my heart aching for the boy he'd been, but my resolve firm. "Michael," I said, "this house is mine, legally fully mine. I'm not selling and I'm not leaving." His eyes widened, then narrowed. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice sharp. I didn't answer. I picked up the watering can and walked inside, leaving him standing among the roses. That night I hung a new painting in the hallway, a woman standing tall, surrounded by roses, her face lit by dawn. Karen saw it and scoffed, but I didn't care. The letter from Ms. Delgado was ready, the nonprofit was on board, and the women's group was behind me. The truth was coming, not as a shout, but as a quiet, unshakable force. I was Margaret, and I was ready to show them who truly owned this house, not just in name, but in spirit, in love, in legacy. The moment I walked away from Michael in the garden, leaving his question unanswered, I felt a shift inside me. It wasn't triumph, not yet, but a quiet certainty, like the click of a lock sliding into place. I'd spent so long hoping they'd see me waiting for their love to return, but now I understood their acknowledgement wasn't what made me whole. I was whole because I chose to be, because I was building something bigger than their rejection. The letter from Ms. Delgado sat in my desk drawer, its words formal and final, ready to lay bare the truth about the house. The nonprofit's plans were moving forward, their enthusiasm a spark that lit my own. And the rose-shaped pendant from Joan hung around my neck, a talisman of the strength I'd reclaimed. I was ready not for a fight, but for a reckoning one that would be mine to define. The days that followed were charged with an undercurrent of unease. Karen's silence had hardened into a wall, her movements sharp as she rearranged furniture or slammed drawers, as if asserting her claim to the house through sheer force. Ruth's barbs grew more pointed, her voice carrying a smugness that grated against my calm. "You're awfully quiet these days, Margaret," she said one morning, her eyes glinting over her coffee. Planning to move out soon, I smiled, stirring my tea, and said nothing. Let her think she'd won. Let them all think they had the upper hand. I was learning the power of silence, of letting their assumptions build a stage for the truth I'd soon reveal. Michael was the hardest to face. His confusion from the garden lingered, his glances longer and more searching. I caught him watching me sometimes, when I was painting in the attic or watering the roses, his brow furrowed as if trying to reconcile the mother he'd known with the woman I was becoming. I wanted to reach for him to pull him back to the boy who'd promised to protect me, but I couldn't. Not yet. He'd chosen Karen's narrative, chosen to see me as a burden, and I had to let him sit with that choice. My love for him hadn't faded, but it no longer blinded me. I was fighting for myself now, and that meant holding firm even when my heart ached. I poured my energy into the sanctuary. The nonprofit had sent a consultant, a warm woman named Sarah, who visited the house one afternoon while Michael and Karen were at work. We walked through the rooms, her notebook filling with ideas, a counseling room here, a communal kitchen there, a library in the attic. She saw the roses in the garden and smiled. "This place already feels like healing," she said. I told her about Tom, about the life we'd built, about the women's group that had saved me. She listened, her eyes kind, and when we finished, she took my hand. "Margaret, this house isn't just a building. It's a legacy, and you're making it a gift." Her words settled into me heavy with truth. This was what I wanted, not just to keep the house, but to give it purpose, to let it hold the stories of women like me. At the women's group, I shared Sarah's visit, and the room buzzed with excitement. Grace offered to design a menu for the future kitchen. Linda volunteered to research funding, and Joan suggested a name, Rose Haven, after the roses that had become my symbol of resilience. I loved it. Rose Haven felt right, a name that carried Tom's love, my strength, and the promise of new beginnings. I went home that night and painted a sign for the future, a simple canvas with Rose Haven in flowing script surrounded by roses. I hung it in my room, hidden behind a curtain, waiting for the day it could stand at the gate. Clara, as always, kept me grounded. "You're close, Margaret," she said at the library, her eyes sharp. "But you need to tell them soon. They're not going to stop pushing until you draw the line." I knew she was right. Karen had mentioned the realtor again this time, leaving a business card on the kitchen counter like a taunt. Michael had started dropping hints about downsizing for my comfort. Ruth, oblivious to the storm brewing, kept up her commentary, each word a spark against my resolve. I nodded at Clara, my heart steady. "I'm almost ready," I said. "I just need one more piece." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Clara trusted me, and that trust was a gift I carried close. The final piece came unexpectedly. One morning, as I sorted through old files in the attic, I found a letter Tom had written before he died. It was tucked inside a book of poetry, his handwriting shaky but clear. "Maggie," it began. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, but you're still here, and that's what matters. You're the heart of this house, the strength of our family. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Keep the roses blooming, keep your dreams alive, and know I'm with you always." Tears blurred the words, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of love that hadn't faded. Tom had seen me even when I'd forgotten myself. I folded the letter and slipped it into my notebook next to the deed and the nonprofit's plans. It was the piece I'd needed, the reminder that my strength wasn't new. It had always been there waiting. That evening, I did something bold. I took Tom's watch, the one I'd worn every day, and placed it on my nightstand. It had carried me this far, but now I needed to stand on my own. In its place, I wore the rose pendant from Joan, its cool metal grounding me. I looked in the mirror at the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, and saw not age, but resilience. I was Margaret, and I was enough. The letter from Ms. Delgado was ready. The nonprofit was moving forward, and Tom's words were with me. It was time. The next morning, I called a meeting with the family. I left a note on the kitchen table, simple and direct. "We need to talk. 7 p.m. living room." Margaret. Karen scoffed when she saw it, muttering about wasting time, but Michael's face was unreadable. Ruth predictably complained, but I didn't care. I spent the day preparing, not with anger, but with calm. I walked through the house, touching the walls. Tom and I had painted the roses. I'd replanted the paintings I'd hung. I read Tom's letter again, its words a steadying force. And I held the lawyer's letter, its weight a promise of clarity. At 7 p.m., I walked into the living room. Michael sat on the couch, his arms crossed. Karen stood by the window, her face tight. Ruth perched on an armchair, her teacup in hand. The kids were upstairs, their music a faint hum. I stood in the center of the room, the rose pendant catching the light, and took a breath. "I've let you believe this house is yours," I said, my voice steady. "I've let you treat me like a guest, a burden. But that ends tonight." Karen's eyes narrowed. Ruth snorted, but Michael leaned forward, his brow furrowed. I held up the lawyer's letter, its seal unbroken. "This house is in my name," I said. "Tom and I paid for it every penny. I've paid the taxes, the repairs, the bills. It's mine legally and fully. I set the letter on the coffee table, unopened, letting its presence speak. Karen laughed sharp and disbelieving. "You're delusional, Margaret. You can't afford this place." I met her eyes unflinching. "I can, and I have. You've been living here because I allowed it, not the other way around." Michael's face paled. "Mom," he said, his voice low, "what are you saying?" I turned to him, my heart aching but my resolve firm. "I'm saying I'm done being invisible. I've given you everything, my love, my home, my support, but you've taken it for granted, all of you." I looked at Ruth, whose mouth was open, and Karen, whose fists were clenched. "This house is becoming something new," I said. "A sanctuary for women who've been discarded like me. It's called Rose Haven, and it's my legacy." The room was silent, the air thick with shock. I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. My truth was enough. I picked up the letter, placed it back in my hand, and walked out, leaving them to their thoughts. The storm had broken, and I was still standing, not in anger, but in dignity. The roses outside glowed in the moonlight, and I knew whatever came next, I was ready. The silence in the living room after I spoke was heavier than any storm I'd weathered. It wasn't the quiet of defeat or surrender. It was the stillness of truth settling into a space that had been filled with lies for too long. I stood there, the lawyer's letter in my hand, the rose pendant warm against my chest, and felt the weight of their eyes. Michael's shock, Karen's fury, Ruth's disbelief. I didn't need to shout or cry or beg for them to understand. My words, steady and clear, had done the work. I'd shown them who I was not with vengeance, but with the dignity I'd fought so hard to reclaim. As I walked out, leaving them to grapple with the truth, I felt lighter, as if I'd shed a skin that no longer fit. The roses outside glowed under the moon, and I knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, the house was a different kind of quiet, like the hush before a reckoning. I moved through my routine with purpose, watering the rosebush sketching plans for Rose Haven, painting a new canvas of a woman standing in a field of light, but I could feel their unease like a current running through the walls. Karen was the first to break the silence. She cornered me in the kitchen as I poured my coffee, her face tight with barely contained rage. "You can't be serious, Margaret," she said, her voice low and sharp. "You think you can just claim this house and turn it into some charity. This is our home too." I set my cup down, meeting her eyes without flinching. "It's my home, Karen," I said. "It always has been. You've lived here because I allowed it, but that doesn't make it yours." Her mouth opened, then closed, her hands balling into fists. For a moment, I thought she'd argue, but she turned and stormed out, leaving the air crackling behind her. Michael was next. He found me in the garden, his face drawn, his hands stuffed in his pockets like the boy he used to be. "Mom," he said, his voice hesitant, "can we talk? Really talk?" My heart ached for him, for the son who'd once run to me with scraped knees and big dreams, but I kept my guard up. "I'm listening," I said, setting the watering can down. He shifted his eyes, darting to the roses, then back to me. "I didn't know," he said. "About the house, about everything. Why didn't you tell us?" The question stung, but I didn't let it show. I shouldn't have had to. "Michael," I said, "you're my son. You should have seen me." His face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the boy I'd raised lost and searching. But then he straightened, his voice hardening. "Karen's upset. She thinks you're trying to push us out." I shook my head, my voice calm but firm. "I'm not pushing anyone out. I'm taking back what's mine. What you do with that is up to you." He stared at me, then walked away, his shoulders slumped. I watched him go, my heart heavy but my resolve unbroken. Ruth predictably was the loudest. She confronted me at dinner, her voice carrying over the clink of dishes. The kids were there, their eyes wide, and Michael and Karen sat in tense silence. "This is ridiculous," Margaret Ruth said, her teacup slamming against the table. "You're too old to be playing these games. You can't run a house, let alone some fantasy shelter. You're embarrassing yourself." The room went still, the air thick with expectation. I set my fork down, my pulse steady, and looked at her. "Ruth," I said, my voice clear, "you've been a guest in my home for years. I've paid for your food, your bills, your comfort. If anyone's playing games, it's you pretending you have a say." Her face reddened, her mouth opening to retort, but I stood my chair, scraping the floor. "This conversation is over," I said, and walked out, leaving the weight of my words behind. The lawyer's letter, still unopened, became a symbol in the days that followed. I kept it on the coffee table, its presence a quiet challenge. Karen avoided it, her eyes flicking away whenever she passed. Michael stared at it sometimes, his expression unreadable. Ruth muttered about bluffing, but her voice lacked conviction. I didn't need to open it yet. Its existence was enough a reminder that the truth was mine to wield. But I knew the real revelation was coming, not just for them, but for everyone. Rosehaven wasn't just a dream, it was a plan, and it was time to make it public. I met with Sarah from the nonprofit again, this time at a local community center where they were hosting a fundraiser. She introduced me to a small group of donors, women and men who listened as I shared my story. Not the pain of Michael's betrayal or Karen's cruelty, but the strength I'd found, the vision for Rosehaven. I told them about the house, about Tom's roses, about the women's group that had saved me. My voice shook at first, but as I spoke, I felt the pendant against my chest. Tom's letter in my heart, and I grew steadier. When I finished, the room was quiet, then broke into applause. A woman in her 60s, her eyes bright with tears, took my hand. "You're giving us hope, Margaret," she said. "All of us." I smiled, my throat tight, and knew I was on the right path. Sarah pulled me aside afterward, her face alight with excitement. "We've got a grant lined up," she said, "and 2 donors want to match funds for the renovation. Rosehaven is happening, Margaret. We just need your final approval to move forward." I nodded, my heart racing. "Do it," I said. "Let's make it real." She hugged me, and I felt the weight of possibility settle into me, not heavy, but grounding. I went home that night and painted a canvas of roses blooming under a dawn sky, a woman's silhouette standing tall. It was for Rosehaven, for the women who'd come after me, for the legacy I was building. The public revelation came sooner than I'd planned. The nonprofit announced Rosehaven at a community event, inviting me to speak. I hesitated, knowing Michael, Karen, and Ruth would find out, but Clara's voice echoed in my mind, "Don't hide anymore." So I went. The event was held in a local park with tables of food and music playing softly. I stood on a small stage, the rose pendant catching the sunlight, and told my story, not the whole truth, but enough. I spoke of losing my husband, of feeling invisible, of finding strength in community. I spoke of the house, my home, and my dream, to turn it into Rosehaven, a sanctuary for women who'd been discarded. The crowd listened, their faces soft with understanding, and when I finished, they clapped, some standing, some wiping tears. I saw Grace, Linda, and Joan in the audience, their smiles bright, and felt a surge of pride. Word spread quickly. A local paper picked up the story, printing a small article about Rosehaven with my name and a photo of the house. I didn't tell Michael or Karen, but I knew they'd see it, and they did. 2 days later, Michael stormed into the living room, the newspaper in his hand, his face a mix of anger and betrayal. "Mom," he said, his voice shaking, "what is this? You're giving our house away." Karen stood behind him, her arms crossed, her eyes blazing. Ruth was there too, her mouth set in a thin line. I stood the lawyer's letter in my hand and faced them. "This house is mine," I said, my voice calm but unshakable. "It's been mine since Tom and I bought it, since we paid every bill, every tax. I've been the one keeping it standing, not you." I held up the letter, still unopened. "This proves it, but I don't need to open it for you to know the truth. You've treated me like a burden, like I don't belong. But I do. and I'm choosing to use this house for something bigger than us." I set the letter down and looked at Michael, my heart aching, but my resolve firm. Rose Haven is happening. The nonprofit is moving forward, and the house will be a sanctuary for women who need it. You can stay for now, but only if you respect that. Karen laughed sharp and bitter. "You're out of your mind, Margaret. You can't do this." But her voice wavered, and I saw the doubt in her eyes. Michael stared at me, his face pale. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking, "why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him, my son, and felt the weight of all we'd lost. "I tried," I said, "but you stopped listening." Ruth started to speak, but I raised a hand, silencing her. "This isn't a discussion," I said. "It's done." I walked out, leaving them with the truth, the letter, the reality of who I was. That night I stood in the garden, the roses fragrant in the cool air. I touched the pendant, thought of Tom's letter, and felt peace. They knew now not just that I owned the house, but that I was Margaret Strong, whole, unstoppable. Rose Haven was coming, and with it a new chapter, not just for me, but for every woman who'd ever been told she was nothing. The truth had been spoken, and the house felt different now, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. The air was no longer thick with unspoken grievances or the weight of their assumptions. I'd stood in the living room, faced Michael, Karen, and Ruth, and claimed my place not with anger, but with a quiet strength that left them speechless. The lawyer's letter, still unopened, sat on the coffee table like a sentinel, its presence enough to anchor my words. Rose Haven was no longer just a dream. It was a promise etched in the roses I'd replanted, the paintings I'd hung, the plans I'd set in motion. As I stood in the garden that night, the moon casting silver over the roses, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I was Margaret, and I was whole. The days that followed were a delicate dance of change. Michael was quieter, his eyes carrying a mix of guilt and confusion. He didn't bring up selling the house again, and the realtor's card disappeared from the kitchen counter. Karen's hostility simmered, but it was tempered now, her sharp glances softened by uncertainty. Ruth for once held her tongue, her usual barbs replaced by a wary silence. I didn't gloat or push. I didn't need to. The truth had shifted the ground beneath them, and they were still finding their footing. I moved through the house with a calm purpose, tending the roses, painting, meeting with Sarah from the nonprofit. Rose Haven was taking shape, and with it, my sense of self grew stronger. I met with the women's group the next week, and their pride in me was a warmth I carried home. Joan handed me a small hand-painted sign that read, "Rose Haven," its letters twined with roses. "For when you're ready to hang it," she said, her eyes shining. Grace shared recipes she'd written for the future kitchen, and Linda gave me a list of local businesses willing to donate supplies. Their support was more than encouragement. It was a reminder that I wasn't alone, that Rose Haven was a shared dream, a tapestry woven from all our stories. I went home and hung Joan's sign in my room next to the canvas I'd painted, waiting for the day it could stand at the gate. Clara, ever my guide, sensed the shift in me. "You did it, Margaret," she said over coffee, her smile fierce. "You showed them not with a fight, but with your truth." "How do you feel?" I thought of the roses, of Tom's letter, of the pendant around my neck. "I feel free," I said the words, surprising me with their weight. Free not from them, but from the need for their approval. Free to be Margaret, to build Rose Haven, to live the life I'd almost forgotten. Clara nodded, her eyes soft. "That's what I wanted to hear," she said. "Now keep going. You're not done yet." She was right. Rose Haven was moving forward, but there were still choices to make, bridges to cross. The nonprofit had secured the grant, and renovations were scheduled to begin in the spring. Sarah and I walked through the house again, finalizing plans. The attic would become a library, the guest room a counseling space, the garden a place for healing. I signed the trust papers, officially designating the house as Rose Haven's future home, with provisions for me to stay as long as I wished. It felt right not just for me, but for Tom, whose love had built this house, and for the women who'd come after me, whose stories would fill its walls. At home, I began to see Michael differently. He started small, hesitant steps toward me, bringing me a cup of tea one morning, asking about the roses lingering in the kitchen as I cooked. I didn't rush to meet him halfway. I'd spent too long chasing his affection. But I didn't turn him away either. One evening, as I sat in the garden, he joined me, his hands clasped tightly. "Mom," he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much this house meant, how much you've done." I looked at him, my son, and saw the boy I'd loved, but also the man who'd hurt me. "I needed you to see me, Michael," I said. "Not just the house, but me." He nodded, his eyes wet, and for the first time in years, I felt a flicker of hope for us. Not a full reconciliation, not yet, but a crack in the wall between us. Karen was harder. Her pride kept her distant, her apologies unspoken. But I noticed changes, dishes washed without complaint, my paintings left untouched, a softening in her tone when she spoke to the kids. I didn't forgive her, not fully, but I let go of the anger. Holding on to it would only weigh me down, and I was done carrying burdens that weren't mine. Ruth surprisingly left. She announced one morning that she was moving in with a cousin, her bags packed, before I could respond. "This house isn't what it used to be," she said, her voice sharp but hollow. I didn't argue. I helped her carry a suitcase to the car and watched her go, feeling only relief. The house was lighter without her, its air cleaner. The kids, my grandchildren, were the unexpected gift. They started seeking me out, drawn by the paintings, the roses, the quiet strength I carried. One afternoon, my granddaughter Lily sat with me in the garden, her earbuds off for once. "Grandma," she said, "are you really turning the house into a shelter?" I nodded, telling her about Rose Haven, about the women it would help. Her eyes widened and she smiled. "That's cool," she said, and I laughed, my heart lifting. Her brother Ethan joined us later, asking about Tom, about the roses, about me. I told them stories I'd never shared, and for the first time I felt seen by them, not as a relic, but as a person with a life, a heart, a legacy. As spring approached, Rose Haven became real. The nonprofit held a groundbreaking ceremony in the garden with a small crowd of donors, volunteers, and the women's group. I stood by the rose bush I'd planted Joan's sign now at the gate and spoke briefly, my voice steady. "This house was built with love," I said, "and now it will hold love for others. Rose Haven is for every woman who's been told she's nothing, who's ready to rise." The crowd clapped, and I saw Clara's proud grin, Sarah's nod, Michael's quiet presence in the back. Karen wasn't there, but I didn't need her to be. This was my moment, my truth. That night, I did something final, something for me. I took the rose pendant from around my neck and placed it in a small wooden box, along with Tom's letter and a single rose petal from the garden. I buried the box beneath the rose bush, my hands steady in the cool earth. It wasn't a goodbye to Tom or the women's group, but a passing of the torch, a way to honor the strength I'd found and the women who'd helped me find it. I stood, brushed the soil from my hands, and looked at the house, its windows glowing with the promise of new stories. I live differently now, with grace, with purpose. Michael and I are rebuilding slowly our conversations, tentative but real. Karen keeps her distance, but I see her watching, learning. The kids visit the garden often, their laughter a new kind of music. Rose Haven is growing its first residents due in the fall, and I'm part of it not just as the owner, but as a guide, a listener, a woman who knows what it means to rise. I paint every day my canvases, filling the house with color, with life. And I walk the garden, the roses blooming brighter than ever, their roots deep and strong. I don't know if I've forgiven Michael, Karen, or Ruth, but I've forgiven myself for shrinking, for waiting, for thinking I was less. I'm at peace now, not because they've changed, but because I have. I'm Margaret, and I've chosen to honor myself, to live with dignity, to build a legacy that will outlast me. As I stand in the garden, the roses swaying in the breeze, I think of every woman watching every heart that's felt discarded. And I want to tell you this. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. Plant your roses, write your story, and let the world see you bloom.